one way I like to say is that hope is actually radical. Actually, what's radical is to say, I can imagine a world where we have a 3-day weekend, or we have complete gender equality, or people are able to move, or we have an economy in harmony with nature. And the thing is, to say those kind of hopes and dreams out loud involve a lot of vulnerability. All of the oppression and injustice in the world has been constructed by people. What that means is we can construct new, more just ways of living. We have to believe that today's reality is not how it has to be. So it's, in a way, you could think of it like the things we think today are the actions we take tomorrow. I think that's a really important distinction, the sort of communication that we do sort of organizationally or traditionally versus what's more strategic. So I think on a traditional level, we've always thought that our communication is trying to raise awareness. And what I would like to say is that we should think of strategic communication as actually changing awareness. And so what I mean there is this basic insight in brain science or around human behavior is that we as human beings learn behavior from what we see other people doing and thinking. So we can't act a certain way or think a certain way unless we've learned that from seeing someone else say it. And that's really important for social change. If we want the way we act or behave or think or live to change, someone has to put that new way of being out there in the world for us to copy. And so if social change communication is focused on showing only what's wrong with the world, how are we ever going to learn to do those new things? How is the change going to happen? So that's where the difference comes in is, of course, there's a role for showing, making aware the things that are happening that we don't want to see. But that's just raising awareness. And the question we have to ask ourselves is, once my audience know the bad thing is happening, what do I want them to do next? And so at the very least, we have to balance that traditional communication with that strategic imperative to actually change society by showing how the society could be. But actually, it may also prove that there is enough information out there about the problem, but what's missing is the alternative possibilities that could drive how we think, how we behave in that new direction. You know, it's so much injustice that has been constructed, built into our societies that we all carry as well in the form of conscious or unconscious bias. But what I find gives me hope, actually, is when we talk about those complex constructs in society. Actually, just a partner of mine, Fotis Philippe, another hope-based expert, he said, gender is a construct. But then as soon as he said that, I realized, well, yes, all of the oppression and injustice in the world has been constructed by people. What that means is we can construct new, more just ways of living and structures and institutions. And so I think the challenge we face actually, not just in terms of, rather than thinking in terms of threat or opportunity, there's an actual practical challenge for us. We have the tools as social change organizations to build new constructs, to nurture and grow more healthy ways of being. And so I think the challenge we all face is, again, something that comes from human nature. We all have a built-in negativity bias. The job of our brain is to keep us safe from harm. And so naturally, then our brain is going to err on the safe side. What is that thing? I don't know what it is. Let's assume it's harmful, right? That's how we stay alive. For building for building new constructs, for building a fairer society, that's complicated. And that brain of ours that's so focused, built around survival, isn't cut out to do that. And so what we all have to do is we can learn using tools like mindfulness. We can be aware when our brain is in that survival mode. We can take deep breaths and use all these other wonderful tools that are commonplace now in sort of fields like self-care. I think our challenge is how we bring that into activism so that we think with our more calm, evolved brain in our work, in our activism, so that we can actually go about building these new things. And so just put that in more simple terms, right? There's so much horrible injustice. There's so much horror in the world every day that we can look at and see. The challenge is, how do we hold that and look at that while at the same time saying it does not have to be this way? There's another way this could be, and to start actually building that, to start carrying out that in our own actions, so that other people start copying it and following it. So I think that's that sums up a little bit like the challenge where we are right now in making this shift towards being less fear-based and more hope-based. We like to share in workshops a quote from Rebecca Solnit, who wrote this book, Hope in the Dark. She said, "Violence is the power of the state. Non-violence and imagination is the power of civil society." And so in the light of that quote, in a way you see civil society's work is literally imagining how things could be, because we need to imagine things to make them possible, to be able to act on them. And so in practice, the work of hope-based communication is actually, you summed it up really well. It's about people themselves using this method to actually remind themselves to do some imagination at the start of the process. But so the idea is that actually, rather than someone like me or another hope-based expert coming and telling people what their hope is, what to say, the point for us is, rather than finding a hopeful story, it's about everyone being able to find the hope in every story, or primarily in their story. Because again, if we want to change how societies work, if we want to change narratives, all of us actually need to be putting forward these ideas of how we want things to be in future. We need to be able to talk about our change. And as we've been discussing, it's so much easier to point out real problems and harms in this world because we can just point at them. But to look inwards and take an idea of how things could be and put them out, that's actually a lot harder. So I think that's why we have that sense of, which you just said, of reaction. And so what I like to say is, like, fear is reaction, hope is action. And so essentially what we ask people to do is we can either have them apply to their daily work or go through the shifts and literally write down, here's my fear, what's the exact opposite of that? So what would be my hope? If we're documenting a problem, can we also document the solution? And actually, maybe do we need to dedicate more focus on showing people that our solution works? And then the third shift is inspired by the communications expert Anachenko Osorio, who always likes to say you should talk about what you're for, not just what you're against. And this goes also then, the work we do within that shift is looking at our values. Like what do we stand for, but also just in terms of ideas. What's the way of thinking that we need to have more of in society? And there we get to things like caring, kindness, empathy, compassion, and how do we actually build those out more in the world? Then our fourth shift is threat to opportunity. So that's where we think very much of like, how are we trying to mobilize people? And actually, we try and moving away actually from mobilizing more to organizing, which I think something we should talk about later. But essentially, rather than trying to make our audience feel guilty or shame, to give them a chance to be part of our movement and think of also like how people what actions people can take that makes them share our values. What's really important there is the understanding that a lot of how people think, for example, trends like confirmation bias, right, where just seeing facts doesn't necessarily change people's mind. A lot of our decision making is caught up in our identity, in a sense of belonging to a group. And so actually a lot of social change work is about creating that group belonging. And then our final shift is victim to human. And so obviously part of that is just trying to counter those old habits, that things like poverty porn, which I think is hopefully out of our movements now, but we still have perhaps more subtle forms of that, like say good immigrant narratives when we talk about migration, or white savior narratives. And so that shift, we try and ask ourselves, who are the characters in our story? And essentially try and make sure we're not telling people's story for them, that people are protagonists in their own story. But then when we in one simple use of this is essentially for people to apply the shifts on their own to their work every day. And really it's just about training a mindset then that people can use. But we also use those shifts to design new strategies. So once we go through all those shifts, we find we have like the basic structure of new narratives, new communication strategies that we can actually start trying to tell stories that shape attitudes and behavior long term. Yeah, what's really like why this approach I think is important for us is the sort of challenge that we have wanted to react to designing this approach is we have populist authoritarians all over the world who are really good at leading the agenda and setting the debate with fear. And they will say something controversial or toxic and they get rewarded for it with attention, because attention is the currency of this digital age. And so you can say, I like to say, the way I feel sometimes in a lot of countries is, a politician can say something that would get them kicked out of a pub because it's so outrageous, but they could get, instead of being kicked out of the pub, they're put on the front page of the newspaper. And so this is that challenge of we react to them, and then the whole conversation becomes around, the far right are growing in Europe, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy because there's no one else on the spectrum. For example, like Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, he's just hung around 15 years saying outrageous things, and no other politician has sort of stayed on the scene that long. He's just sort of filled the space of our imagination of what politics is. And I think this is what other populists do as well. And so we need to have it's a really simple formula at the base of narrative change, which is repetition. A lie repeated 3 times starts to feel true. And so we really have to just simply repeat and make familiar basic ideas for them to stick. And so from a social change perspective, that might be things like kindness, caring, compassion, empathy. We're all human beings. Communities are strong when we take care of each other. For you to articulate, anyone who's using hope-based communication, what are you actually for? And so the point is to achieve that constant repetition. I feel the only way for it to be something that all of us repeat every day is for it to actually be truth, as in the actual values that drive us. And I think what happens in a lot of social change work is we either don't think about, or we just bury deep down inside us the reasons we do this work. And so we don't talk about it because we think you're not meant to talk about love and care and kindness because that's not political realism, that's not common sense, it's not utilitarian. And so our values are never getting talked about. And so what we're actually essentially trying to do is get activists to sort of excavate within themselves their own why, and so that they actually then start repeating it all the time. Just take, for example, migration. A lot of the times we'll hear people say, we should welcome migrants because it's good for the economy. But I can guarantee you, I don't think there's anyone working in migrant rights and human rights who does it because they think migration is good for the economy. They do it because we're all human beings, and no matter who we are or where we come from, we should be welcomed and we should have welcome opening societies. But we don't often say that. And so, I just wanted to I thought that was so important what you said. Is like for this to be sustainable, it actually has to be our own values.
Looking for more resources in topics like countering disinformation, cybersecurity, personal and organizational resiliency, building positive narratives, or media literacy? Visit the Hive Mind platform, an online hub with free content, tools, online courses, and ability to connect with digital activists across the globe. Embrace the power of community with Hive Mind.